All right, guys, in this video, we're going to go over the inverse cosine function. So it says the cosine function is decreasing and 1 to 1 on the interval 0 to 2 pi. So, sorry, 0 to pi. So it's 1 to 1 on the interval 0 to pi, as shown in the figure. So remember, 1 to 1 means that it has to pass the horizontal line test. So obviously, if we were to draw a horizontal, draw horizontal lines through the original cosine function, it wouldn't pass it. And remember from the inverse sine function, it was negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. So if we were to try to do it from negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2, that also wouldn't work. So we have to shift the interval to 0 to pi instead. Okay, and it would pass the horizontal line test there. Consequently, on this interval, the cosine function has an inverse function. The inverse cosine function is denoted by either arc cos of x or y equals cos inverse. Okay, so using your knowledge of inverses to use your knowledge of inverses to graph y equals cos inverse of x from y equals cosine of x. And then how does the domain and range compare with cosine? So we're going to fill in the table of values from 0 to pi, right? So let's just do a quick unit circle review. So we know that at x equals 0, cosine is 1. We'll go to pi over 6 next. At pi over 6, we're radical 3 over 2. It's pi over 6. Okay. Pi over 4, we're going to be at radical 2 over 2. Pi over 3, we're going to be at a half. Pi over 2, we're back to 0. So that's apparent, right, from when we graph the cosine parent function. And then now we're going to go into quadrant 2. So the next line will be 2 pi over 3 from the unit circle. And that's going to be negative a half. 3 pi over 4, because again, we're in quadrant 2. So all these values are going to become negative. Negative radical 2 over 2. And then 5 pi over 6. So remember, the reference angle is pi over 6, so it's going to be negative radical 3 over 2. And then at pi, we're at negative 1. Okay, and that's again illustrated here on the cosine function. So the domain for cosine of x, the original function, it's negative infinity to infinity, because I could plug in any value that I want in for x and I will get an output. And the range, it's negative 1 to 1 inclusive, right? Because positive 1 is our max, negative 1 is our minimum. So remember, for the inverse functions, right, our domain and range are going to be reversed. So our domain for arc cosine or cos inverse is going to be negative 1 to 1. And then our range is going to be from 0 to pi, because that is the interval, the smallest interval where the range of values from negative 1 to 1 will be reached. Okay, so we'll have 1, 0, radical 3 over 2, radical 3 over 2, pi over 6, radical 2 over 2, pi over 4. And I'm just going to continue filling in these values. A half, pi over 3, 0 pi over 2, negative a half, 2 pi over 3, negative, oops, negative radical 2 over 2. 3 pi over 4. Negative radical 3 over 2. 5 pi over 6. And then negative 1 pi. Okay, so here we go. Let's graph negative 1, positive 1 for our domain, and then our range is going to go from 0 to pi. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So remember, I'm just going to label the x-axis as well, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. So at negative 1, we're at pi. That means it's a little bit above 3, so somewhere around here-ish, I would say. Okay. And then negative 1, let's see, is there, so negative a half, 2 pi over 3, so negative a half, and then this is about 6 divided by 3, so it's a little bit more than 2. So negative a half and then a little bit more than 2. And then 0 pi over 2 is another one that we can plot. 0 pi over 2. So it's about 0 and a little bit more than 1.5. 1, we're at 0. So our cosine, the graph is going to look something like, oops, let's try to do this again. Something like that, where it's kind of this graph. If we could imagine it kind of flipped over this line of reflection like that. So that's what we have. That's what we have here. Okay. So again, to answer this question, how does the domain and range compare with the original cosine function? The domain and range, let's do this in a different color. And range of cos inverse is switched, or let's say is interchanged, right, with cosines. All right. So again, using kind of previous knowledge from the knowledge of inverse functions, we were able to graph the arc cosine or the cos inverse function.